Hi, this is Justin Coletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the Sonic Scoop podcast. And today, I've got bad news for you, and I've got good news for you. First, the bad news. The bad news is that if you're listening to this, your hearing probably sucks. And I don't just mean that it sucks. Let me rephrase that. If you're listening to this, your hearing almost certainly sucks. And I mean sucks, like the capital U in the middle. How do I know this about you? We'll get into that in a second. And I don't just mean that your hearing probably sucks in the way that like all human beings' hearing sucks. Like we're all flawed, Fletcher-Munson curve and all that. We all hear some frequencies more intensely than others. No, I mean compared to like the ideal of human hearing, your hearing probably sucks. But I've got good news. And the good news is that it's not that big of a deal. And there are people making much better sounding records than you are right now who have hearing that is worse than yours. In fact, some of the most successful mixing engineers, mastering engineers, producers, recordists have really damaged hearing that is way worse than yours. Fortunately, making music, doing music production, doing audio is not just about hearing. More importantly, it's about listening. And I'm going to give you some ideas and some systems for making the most out of your most likely damaged and imperfect hearing, and making sure that it's not holding you back and making you into one of those people whose hearing might suck compared to the ideal for human beings, but who makes way better sounding records than other people who have even better hearing. Now, I'm not immune to this either. My hearing is not perfect either. Really, no one doing music or audio at a high level, almost no one, has great hearing. And that's why I know that your hearing most likely sucks. Chances are that you are a musician or started as a musician. But even if you're just into music and you've spent a lot of time going to concerts, even, going clubbing, playing in bands, rehearsing, whatever it is, that stuff takes a toll. And chances are a lot of people who are into music professionally, a lot of those people live in big cities and they're dealing with subways and traffic noise and construction noise, all of which take a toll on hearing as well. And as people get older, they tend to lose high frequency hearing the most, but it's not just high frequency hearing. The hearing damage that basically all of us accumulate can also lead to imbalances in the mid-range. And I'm going to give you some ways to kind of evaluate and work around the issues you must most likely have with your hearing. And I'm going to give you some stories that are going to make you feel like it doesn't matter that your hearing isn't perfect. And we're going to lift the veil a little bit and let you know that there are people who you probably respect tremendously who might have hearing worse than yours, who are doing great work anyway. Before we get into it, I should give a brief shout out to our sponsors. One of the big things that I mentioned is counteracting problems of somewhat imperfect hearing with having good systems in place for dealing with them. And if you're really into getting systems that are going to help your mixing improve dramatically, of course, I got the full-length course, Mixing Breakthroughs. It's all about giving you a system, a roadmap, a blueprint to completing every mix in a way that's going to allow you to work more quickly, more confidently, and with better results than ever before, giving you a better finishing rate than ever before on your projects, while having yourself or your clients be even more thrilled with your work. Does this stuff work? Yeah. Thousands of people have taken this course, and some of the feedback and testimonials we've got on, absolutely awesome. I have personally heard people's before and after work on the same track using Mixing Breakthroughs, and I gotta tell you, I'm amazed so much of the time. You gotta check out mixingbreakthroughs.com. I've just heard so many people transform the way they work and really get confidence and efficiency, as well as even better results. Check that out over at mixingbreakthroughs.com. Or if you want to know everything that I know about mastering, which is what I do day in and day out these days, you can check that out at masteringdemystified.com. Both of these have a full money-back guarantee. If you want something totally free, I got you covered there too. We've got the Habits Workshop, the 5 Habits of Every Great Mixer. These are the 5 things that every one of the amazing mixers that I've studied, worked alongside, interviewed, produced master classes, they do these things on basically every single mix, and chances are that you're not doing all 5 of these things. But if you start, your results are going to improve dramatically overnight. Check that out for free over at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits for the free workshop, The 5 Habits of Every Great Mixer. Or if you want something totally free on mastering, we got you covered with Mastering 101 over at sonicscoop.com/mastering 101. We'll get right into the meat of this podcast. Last quick shout out is to Soundtoy, sponsoring this podcast from the beginning, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. You can hear how awesome they are even if you have damaged hearing. Check them out, soundtoys.com. They are making totally excellent stuff with the most generous demo period I've seen in the world of plugins. 30 days to try out all their stuff. Maybe you shouldn't try it out, because if you do, you'll love it and you'll just want to buy the entire Soundtoys 5 bundle, which you probably should. Also, big thanks to Focusrite, making some of the best bang for the buck interfaces out there. Really tremendous value from their entry-level Scarlett line through the mid-range Claret series, all the way up to the high-end RedNet stuff. Great feature set and sound quality, especially for the price. You're really not going to find better value at this stuff at any level, so check them out at Focusrite.com. Okay, getting right into it. Your hearing and sucking. And I'm going to tell you, mine too, to some degree. I actually have surprisingly good hearing for someone who's almost 40, but it's not perfect. And I'll tell you some stories about mine. Before I do, I'm going to relay a story to you. I think I've told this one time before in a podcast episode when I talked about high-res audio and why I'm a little bit of a high-res audio skeptic. And back in my 20s, I taught in some colleges, taught audio engineering, music production courses. And it was really interesting that you'd have, 18, 19, 20-year-olds in their freshmen and sophomores in college, as well as you'd always have some adult learners, people in their 30s and 40s. And I always love to do this thing near the beginning of the semester where I'd play people tones to familiarize them with the frequency spectrum. And I'd ask people when we got really high up there to raise their hand if they heard the tones. 10K, everyone heard it. 12K, pretty much everyone heard it. When you got up to 13, 14, 15K, that's when the hands of the people in their 30s stopped going up. And people in their 40s, their hands would stop going up even earlier. And by the time you were into 17K, 18K, a lot of the 20-something-year-olds' hands stopped going up. And by the time you got up to maybe 19K, there's like one or two freshmen in the back of the class who can actually hear that tone. So we do lose high-frequency hearing as we get older. But it's not only high-frequency hearing. Your ears are most likely asymmetrical. I'd say that naturally, probably everyone's hearing is a little bit asymmetrical. You can kind of test this in another way for yourself right now. If you just close an eye, right? If you close one eye, chances are you'll discover, if you really concentrate and pay attention, that you see a little bit more blue out of one eye and a little bit more red out of the other eye. Your hearing is pretty much the same way. But that kind of thing gets exacerbated if you played in bands at any point and maybe the drummer was always off to your left, or if you were a DJ at any point and you always had your monitor off to your right, or even if you worked an office job and you had like a desk fan off to your left going at 60 dB for 8 hours a day, these things can exacerbate potentially some of these hearing differences between either ear. And we'll get into some solutions and workarounds for that as well. I'll tell you, the first time I really viscerally felt this in my work in the studio was with the high frequency stuff. It was in a mastering session. I was there with the mix engineer who worked on this project. He was probably in his mid to late 20s. I was probably in my early to mid 30s at that point. And there was the client, the artist, who was maybe 20, 21, 22, early 20s, something like that. And we were listening to the master of the first track on his album together, and we were really loving the way things were coming together. And the artist in particular was really blown away. He really liked the mixes already, but the master was just making things feel like it belonged on the shelf with his favorite records. And he really loved the experience of hearing it in the mastering studio and just hearing it transform and get that final level of polish on it. And he was relaying all of this to us, all these positive remarks. I love this about it. I love it. Everything's sounding so great. There's only one thing that I'm having trouble getting over, and it's, what's that clicking? And me and the mix engineer look at each other, look back at him, look at each other again. What clicking? Like that clicking right there. And lo and behold, I brought up a frequency analyzer, and there was a click at 19.5K, which neither I nor the mixing engineer could hear. So lesson learned on that one, right? And lesson is, I always look at every master that I do through a frequency analyzer for particularly that reason. Like I said, for someone who's almost 40, I actually test pretty well. Just checking it out recently, and I could hear up to about 18.5K in one ear and about 17.5K in the other ear, which is really good for someone who's going to be 40 in a few months. That said, it's not a 20-year-old's hearing. So I do have to double check 19.5K through a frequency analyzer to make sure that I'm not missing any weirdness that could be going on there. And that's something I potentially recommend that you do as well for compensating for the fact that your hearing is possibly worse than that, because a lot of people, especially musicians I meet, have trouble above 16K. It usually, by the time people are in their mid-30s, especially if they play in bands or live in cities, they're dropping off at even lower frequency than that, and even more steeply. I also remembered experiencing this for myself with mixing. But here's the interesting thing. I've said it once before, I'll say it again, that audio, music production, it's not about hearing, it's about listening. And when I started to actually get good at mixing is when I started to notice the imbalance between my left and right ear. And I didn't notice it for years because I wasn't that good yet at listening. But as I got better and better at listening, I started to notice, wait a second, this mix of mine, if I flip my headphones around, I thought I had the guitars perfectly balanced on the left side versus the right side, or the guitar against a keyboard, or the tambourine against a shaker. I thought those things were perfectly balanced. And as soon as I flip my headphones around, my goodness, no, one of them is poking out way too much, way more than I thought. And that's because my hearing, like almost everyone you're going to meet, is slightly different in the mid-range between the two ears. And I have a slightly different amount of 2K versus 3K in one ear versus the other. But again, I have systems to deal with this issue, and you can adopt them too. So we already talked about one system, looking at a frequency analyzer for the super high frequency stuff. But you can also, you'll hear this advice many times, listen in mono. And not just any type of mono. You have a few different ways of listening in mono. You can sum through a single speaker. You can have two separate speakers, but you're feeding a mono signal, the same signal to each of them. Or probably my favorite method, acoustic mono, where you might have a set of speakers off to the side somewhere, and they're hitting you kind of together in one spot. And that's going to allow you to check the left-right balances. Also, flipping headphones around. All of these kinds of workarounds can be tremendous for helping you compensate for the fact that you probably have subtle imbalances from left to right. And I think this is one of the many reasons that people often recommend listening in mono. There's also the possibility if you have an analog device that does, or you can do it in your DAW, you can flip sides on your speakers as well. That can be another useful thing to do, and totally, totally recommended. There's another big thing you can do for the bias that all of us have, this Fletcher-Munson curve. Maybe you've heard of this idea, is that we're more sensitive to mid-range frequencies than we are, especially to low-end frequencies, but also to extremely high frequencies. But that sensitivity changes as the level of the music goes up. We hear bass and treble better, and the mid-range tends to soften a little bit. So listening at more than one level can be useful. I recommend for a lot of people 2 consistent levels to deal with this issue. Like you have a standard loud level. You might use your phone and download an SPL monitor for it so you can get a loud level that works for you. For mastering, I like something around 80 dB, maybe somewhere like 80 to 82 dB. For mixing, you might want it to be a little quieter than that. A lot of people might find something more in the maybe 70, 75 dB range for their louder level, but also having a quieter level. And this could be as quiet as 50, 55, 60 dB, something like that. And you'll have 2 different perspectives on your work. And you want to make sure that things sound balanced at both of those levels. And a lot of great mixing engineers do their work at quieter levels. Now, I want to give you a little confidence boost because I kind of wailed on you in the beginning about how your hearing sucks and how it's a problem. And now I want to clarify that it's really not a problem, because some of the best people out there working, say some of my favorite mastering engineers, take Bob Ludwig, one of my favorites in the world, Greg Calby, another one of my favorites in the world, Joe Lambert, who I had the privilege of studying under. These guys, particularly Bob Ludwig and Greg Calby, are a lot older than me and most likely have worse hearing than I do. Does that mean I'm a better mastering engineer than these guys? Not necessarily, no. I do try to compare my masters to the work of great mastering engineers like those who have tremendous results. And I compare my work against people who are doing stuff of that caliber to make sure that every master that I do deserves to sit on the shelf next to stuff done by these guys who've done some of my favorite records, probably some of your favorite records as well. But I can tell you, my hearing is probably better, but those guys, even if they're a bit older and their hearing isn't as good, their listening is tremendous, and they've developed tremendous systems in place to deal with any issues they have around hearing. It's not just in the mastering world. You might have noticed that a lot of your favorite mix engineers are older people. A lot of them in their 50s and 60s are where they start to get really tremendous results in some of their biggest work as mixers. You'll find very few super successful mixers under 40. There are some. Absolutely, you'll find people doing great work in their 20s and 30s. But again, they're often comparing their work to people who are much older, probably with much worse hearing, who are working around it in all these kinds of ways. I just want to give you one example to give you a better feel for this. Imagine we took someone who had like perfect hearing, a hunter-gatherer living out in the wilderness somewhere who's never been around subway trains or a crash cymbal or whatever and has really excellent hearing. And you took him and you put him in a room that was barely treated at all with speakers that weren't great. But you downloaded into his brain a ton of knowledge about audio engineering and music production. And then you took a carbon copy of this person, you cloned him and put him in another room that had great acoustic treatment, amazing monitoring, and he could hear every last detail in that space. Who's going to do the better work? It's going to be the person in the better listening environment. So that's an important thing to recognize. That one of the other key differences is just how well your room is set up and your whole the speakers, the space, or your headphones, that's super important. But not only that, now imagine the same thought experiment again. We take these two clones of each other, we put both of them in great rooms with great speakers and great monitoring. The first one has never been in that room before and is just listening to a few tracks for the first time in that room. Person B, identical room, identical setup, identical skills, has been in that room and heard 1,000 records in that space and knows exactly how they should sound in that space. Who is going to make the better creative choices, the better listening decisions? It's the person who knows the room. It's the person who's been in the space before. And that's another big thing. Almost as important, or potentially even more important than your monitoring system, is how well you know it, how well you're acclimated to it. And that comes not just from doing your own productions in that space, but it comes from listening to tons and tons of records that you love the sound of in that space. Having actual references that give you a sense memory for what really good sounds like in that room. And potentially also what really good looks like in that room. Using a frequency analyzer can be good for checking high frequencies, but can also be good for problems that aren't with your hearing, but problems that are kind of with your whole room, speaker, or headphone environment. You should not only know what your favorite records sound like in your space, but also what they look like too on a frequency analyzer. And if you don't have perfect low end in your room, just seeing the low end on your favorite records and the low end on your records, you might notice, wow, I have a lot more energy below 60 hertz than so many of these records. Or I have so much more energy at 100, not as much at 60. That's something I'm having trouble hearing in my space. So again, the good news here is that although your hearing probably sucks, it doesn't really matter that much. Because just like you can learn a set of speakers, just like you can learn a set of headphones, just like you can learn your room, you can also learn your own hearing. Like I said a little earlier on, I didn't even notice the asymmetry in my ears until I started to get good at audio. It was probably there for years and years, from playing in bands in my 20s and having the drummer off to one side all the time, gave me subtle differences between my two ears. But my listening wasn't good enough to even notice those differences in my hearing. And as your listening improves and as your systems improve, you're going to find more and more workarounds to that issue. We've gone through a few ways of dealing with that in this episode as we went along. And if you want really a complete system to mixing and monitoring, of course, you can check out the full-length course, Mixing Breakthroughs, over at mixingbreakthroughs.com, where you get a full system for not just listening and evaluating, but also for using references, for using effects, for really understanding and hearing, compression and limiting, and a whole lot more. If you prefer something on mastering, I got the full-length course on mastering, Mastering Demystified. You can check over at masteringdemystified.com. Both of these have full money-back guarantees. Also, a big shout out and thanks to our sponsors, Soundtoys. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Also, big shout out and thanks to Focusrite. Focusrite making some of the best interfaces out there, some of the best values in interfaces too, from their best-selling entry-level Scarlett series all the way up to the high-end RedNet series. Hard to find better bang for the buck, better value, and better overall quality than you're going to find with Focusrite, so check those guys out too. If you want something totally for free, of course, I got you covered there. You can check out the free workshop, The 5 Habits of Every Great Mixer, over at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. Or if you want the free workshop on mastering, got you covered over at Mastering 101. Check that out at sonicscoop.com/mastering 101 for a comprehensive primer on all things mastering to get you started. All right, this has been Justin Coletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for hanging out with me for this week's episode of the Sonic Scoop podcast. See you next time.